First, from Afghanistan to South Africa to Bangladesh, many coronavirus stories have attracted far less attention, like Barbados, for instance, that Caribbean island and long-time holiday destination. With global lockdowns and travel bans, it too is suffering from the sudden stop in tourism. Prime Minister Mia Mottley has long been public about the dire dangers that Barbados faces, as she says, due to its small size and vulnerability to economic and environmental shocks. And she's joining me now from Bridgetown, Barbados. Prime Minister, welcome to the programme. I just wanted to ask you how your country's doing in terms of infections, in terms of deaths, and to ask you whether I think you've had some quite severe lockdowns and how that's working there.
Thank you very much, Christiane, for having me. We are fighting up not just here in Barbados, but in the Caribbean. At this point in time, I'm actually chairing CARICOM, which is a member state organization of 15 countries, from Bahamas in the north to Guyana and Suriname in the south, from Barbados in the east to Belize in the west. And I can pretty much speak on behalf of all of us that this has been the most destabilizing event for our countries, probably since World War II. I mean, we've heard you speak about that, and others in the UK speak about the fact that this is for them similarly the most destabilizing event. Each of our countries, regrettably, has cases. Each of our countries, in our own case, we have just about 80, and we have just about 7 deaths. Half of the people, just under half, have recovered. But alongside with the pandemic is the very real result of people being able to live and to eat. And I notice it's not just the Caribbean. I've seen stories coming out of Africa and Asia and elsewhere. And this is a real balance. And listening just now to your last interview, both interviews, it is clearly a problem across the world. Our situation is perhaps a little more unique because we suffer a number of risks. One, we are a highly indebted region, largely because we are perhaps the most travel-dependent and trade-dependent region in the world, with almost half of our GDP coming directly and indirectly, and our jobs, from tourism. Secondly, we are also on the cusp of the climate crisis. In fact, we are 4 weeks away from the beginning of the hurricane season. But what is little spoken about is that the climate crisis has also resulted in droughts and sargassum weed, which has meant a number of our hotel establishments and restaurants were already suffering before this pandemic. And now we add this global pandemic. So that this is a peculiar moment for Caribbean states, not just Barbados. And it is one in which we hope we can summon the rest of the global community to recognize that it is now more than ever that we need to recognize that global leadership is needed, and that we need to accept that these islands, as well as those in the South Pacific, are vulnerable.
Well, look, I mean, you just heard me talking about global leadership. I just want to get your take as, you know, the Prime Minister of a significant Caribbean tourist destination, just a very well-known island nation there. In general, your big neighbor to the north, the United States of America, generally takes global leadership, whether it's Ebola, as you heard, whether it was the global financial crash of 2008, whatever it might be, it's usually the US. It's been absent on the world stage. Does that make any difference to you in the Caribbean, to you particularly in Barbados?
I think it does generally, but I think that beyond the US, it is genuinely a time for all countries to step up and for all global leaders. If there's one thing that I'd like to see coming out of this is a global leadership initiative. Look, 75 years ago, the United Nations was formed on the 24th of October. We used the opportunity of post-World War II to create a number of vital institutions to be able to bring countries together to protect the most vulnerable, the weakest among us. We also used it to create the Bretton Woods institutions, which we're relying on. But we need to repurpose these organizations, and in having a global leadership initiative, make sure that we are really reacting to what is real. We are told that we can access concessional funding or grant funding only if we have historic per capita incomes that are below certain levels. Well, Christiane, that is like telling me that I should use my blood pressure reading from 2 years ago to determine whether I'm vulnerable tonight to a stroke. is absolutely futile. And we've been carrying on this thesis and argument for over 30 years. We also had problems when the WTO was formed. We recognized, for example, that much of our domestic production would shut down and it would make us more open. When we had 9/11, we had other issues that were imposed on us on a one-size-fits-all prescription. Now we have this pandemic. We need global leadership similar to what we had post-World War II to be able to recognize that we need a plan that protects not just the strongest among us, but also the most vulnerable. And what should we really be spending money on? Does it make sense to continue to build large military constructs when, as a result of a mosquito or a pandemic, our populations can be put at risk? It doesn't make any sense. Does it make sense for us to see wildfires and hurricane floods every year? Doesn't make any sense.
You're leading me straight to the sort of reimagining how the world emerges from this crisis. Will there be priorities reorganized? But just before I get to that bigger picture, I want to ask you, you explain how dependent your country is on tourism for all aspects of business and the economy. And just in terms of that vulnerability and the vulnerability of many, many other countries around the world which don't have developed healthcare systems or solid economies, what will happen to you and to regional islands, and even you mentioned Africa and other places, if this pandemic, lasts longer, much longer? Can your healthcare systems survive it? And your economy, your island?
I think that's the bigger issue. A number of our healthcare systems are being repurposed in order for us to be able to deal with the issues and to stay ahead of the curve, to use the recent jargon. But really, where we are feeling it more than ever is in the shutdown. To have a hotel with no revenue coming in, to have no airplanes landing from Jamaica and Bahamas in the north right down to Barbados and Trinidad in the south. These things are having a devastating impact, particularly on the smaller islands in the Eastern Caribbean and to a lesser extent Barbados. So that we have now to see how we can hold our people up. Because if you don't have a successful neighborhood, all of us are at risk in terms of public health. All of us are at risk in terms of lack of security. All of us are at risk of migration. So that we really, really need to be able to understand that this is about lives and livelihoods. This is about staving off the pandemic, but it's also about keeping people fed and keeping people being able to live.
Prime Minister, you've been quite forward-leaning, in your public warnings and your desire to reshape priorities and the models by which your success is judged. For instance, you've called for there should be a vulnerability index, assessing potentially how exposed a country is to future economic and public health risks like climate change. I wonder how that would work. And you've also you're asking for natural disaster clauses in your sovereign debt contracts. Explain what that all means and how it would protect you and other vulnerable countries.
Yeah, on the vulnerability index, the Commonwealth Secretariat has in fact settled on a framework since 30 years ago, 1989, 31 years ago. We believe it needs to be revisited, but we believe that you can't determine whether we need access to funding. Let me give an example. This Caribbean region has to pay out $8.8 billion in debt over this year and next year. It's going to have...
Well, we're having some technical difficulties there with our connection to Barbados. I don't know whether we can get the Prime Minister back, but for the moment, we're just going to carry on because she is back. Oh, good. Prime Minister Mottley. Yeah. We did the unheard of. We got you back in the middle of this internet connection. We're working from home and it's all, a little out there. But you know what? I just want to ask you a last question because we were interrupted on that one, but we get the point. You have also launched an initiative of women leaders to help, people through this pandemic. I wonder whether you're the first female Prime Minister of Barbados, and you've probably seen that a lot of female leaders have been held up of having done a really good job, whether it's the Prime Minister of New Zealand, the Chancellor of Germany, some of the Scandinavian and European countries, and yourself. Anything about female leadership that you would like to tout in a case like this, in a situation like this?
Simply that we care. We care. And we have to care, because in the same way that we want people to take care of the most vulnerable in the household, we want it in the country, and I'm asking you to help us do it internationally. That's why we need a global leadership initiative from Pope Francis and others right back to world leaders. That's why we need to be able to look at our debt and restructure it and repurpose. That's why we need to look and see that moral leadership is important in this world today. And that's why we need to ensure that the Caribbean does not remain invisible and dispensable, nor the South Pacific. And if our voices have to be spoken over and over and over to make this point, we shall not tire to do so, because what is at stake is human lives and the wellness and well-being of global civilization, as was envisaged 75 years ago when the United Nations was established.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Prime Minister, for that. Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados, thanks for joining us, especially with that powerful last appeal.